Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev, who led the Soviet Union from 1964 until his death in 1982, occupies a unique place in 20th century history. His nearly 2 decades at the helm of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, CPSU, made him one of the longest-serving leaders in the Soviet state's history, surpassed only by Joseph Stalin in longevity. Brezhnev presided over a period that came to be remembered as both one of stability and of stagnation. On one hand, his leadership gave Soviet citizens a measure of predictability after the erratic policies and abrupt reforms of Nikita Khrushchev, and it elevated the Soviet Union to a position of apparent military parity with the United States. On the other hand, his unwillingness or inability to reform a creaking economic system, his tolerance of corruption, and his reliance on an aging political elite left the USSR weakened, setting the stage for the crises that would erupt in the 1980s. His life and leadership illustrate the paradox of a state that could project immense power abroad while simultaneously allowing its internal vitality to ebb away. Leonid Brezhnev was born on December 19, 1906, in the industrial town of Kamenskoye in the Yekaterinoslav Governorate of the Russian Empire, today part of Ukraine. His family was of humble origins. His father worked in the steel industry, while his mother maintained the household. From an early age, Brezhnev was surrounded by the rhythms of industrial life and the hardships of the working class. This environment shaped his worldview and would later help him identify closely with the Soviet ideology of proletarian triumph and socialist progress. Brezhnev pursued a technical education rather than an academic one, a path that distinguished him from some other Soviet leaders who came through more intellectual or political routes. He trained in land management and then metallurgy, eventually graduating as a metallurgical engineer. His early career was spent in industrial settings, giving him a practical and grounded perspective on economic production that would influence his later policies, though he would ultimately fail to apply this experience to resolving the systemic inefficiencies of Soviet industry. Brezhnev's political career began through the communist youth organization, the Komsomol, which he joined in 1923. By 1929, he had become a full member of the Communist Party. These early years were formative. He learned how to navigate the world of party bureaucracy and how to cultivate loyalty among peers and subordinates. He proved himself not through flamboyant speeches or visionary thinking, but through steady competence, careful networking, and a willingness to adapt to the demands of the system. The outbreak of the Second World War was a pivotal moment for Brezhnev's generation. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, he was mobilized into the Red Army, where he served in political administration rather than combat. His responsibilities included overseeing troop morale, organizing logistics, and ensuring loyalty to the party line. By the war's end, he had risen to the rank of Major General, a testament less to battlefield heroism than to his skill in organizational and political matters. The war gave Brezhnev both prestige and connections. His service in the political commissariat deepened his ties to influential party members and allowed him to demonstrate his reliability as a loyal servant of the Soviet state. After 1945, he transitioned smoothly back into party work, taking up important regional positions in Ukraine and other republics. His career trajectory was helped enormously by the patronage of Nikita Khrushchev, under whom he served during the latter's tenure as first secretary in Ukraine. Khrushchev recognized Brezhnev's administrative skill and his talent for building networks of loyalty. By the late 1950s, Brezhnev's ascent into the highest echelons of Soviet power was underway. He became a candidate member of the Politburo in 1952, lost some ground during Stalin's death and the immediate post-Stalin reshuffles, but returned to prominence under Khrushchev. In 1957, he was made a full Politburo member, and soon afterward he was entrusted with oversight of the defense industry and space program, areas that symbolized the USSR's modernity and global power. Khrushchev's leadership style, marked by impulsive decisions and sweeping reforms, alienated many within the party elite. Agricultural failures, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and his unpredictable handling of both domestic and foreign policy created an atmosphere of dissatisfaction. Brezhnev, though outwardly loyal, joined the growing number of figures who plotted Khrushchev's removal. In October 1964, Khrushchev was forced into retirement in what was effectively a bloodless coup. Brezhnev, known for his caution and for his ability to mediate between factions, emerged as the compromise candidate to succeed him as first secretary of the Communist Party. At first, his power was balanced by other senior figures, most notably Premier Alexei Kosygin and chairman of the Presidium Nikolai Podgorny. This arrangement gave the appearance of collective leadership, but Brezhnev gradually consolidated authority, edging out rivals and concentrating power in his own hands. By the early 1970s, he had become the undisputed leader of the Soviet Union. Brezhnev's leadership style was deliberate, steady, and conservative. He positioned himself as a stabilizer after the turbulence of Khrushchev. The slogan of his time was "Developed Socialism," a doctrine which proclaimed that the USSR had already reached an advanced stage of socialist society. This was less an ideological innovation than a justification for maintaining the status quo. Domestically, Brezhnev oversaw a period of modest improvements in living standards, particularly in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Housing construction expanded, wages rose gradually, and consumer goods became more available than in previous decades. For many Soviet citizens, especially those who had endured the hardships of the 1930s and 1940s, this era offered a sense of security and predictability. While shortages still occurred and consumer choice was limited compared to Western standards, the Soviet people enjoyed a level of stability that contrasted sharply with earlier upheavals. However, the same conservatism that ensured stability also bred stagnation. Economic growth slowed dramatically after 1973. The centrally planned economy, weighed down by bureaucracy, inefficiency, and corruption, was increasingly unable to keep pace with the technological innovations of the West. Heavy industry and defense continued to receive the lion's share of investment, while consumer goods and agriculture lagged behind. Agricultural policies remained problematic, as collective farms proved inefficient, and attempts to stimulate productivity through increased subsidies only deepened dependence without solving structural issues. Corruption became endemic during Brezhnev's era. His reliance on patronage networks, notably the so-called Dnipropetrovsk mafia of associates from his early career, fostered a culture of favoritism. While this ensured loyalty to Brezhnev personally, it also entrenched inefficiency and cynicism within the system. Culturally and politically, Brezhnev presided over a tightening of controls. The liberalization of the Khrushchev thaw gave way to censorship and repression. Writers, intellectuals, and dissidents who challenged the state faced censorship, harassment, or imprisonment. The use of psychiatric hospitals to silence political opponents became a notorious feature of the period. While mass terror on the Stalinist scale was absent, dissent was systematically suppressed, ensuring that the Soviet political climate remained rigid and unyielding. Brezhnev's foreign policy was characterized by a combination of assertiveness and cautious engagement. Perhaps his most enduring contribution was the articulation of the Brezhnev Doctrine, which asserted that the Soviet Union had both the right and the obligation to intervene in socialist countries where socialism was deemed under threat. This doctrine was invoked to justify the 1968 invasion of Czechoslovakia, which crushed the Prague Spring reform movement. By enforcing strict conformity within the Warsaw Pact, Brezhnev ensured the cohesion of the Eastern Bloc, but at the cost of stifling reform and deepening resentment among satellite states. Beyond Eastern Europe, Brezhnev pursued a policy of global activism. The Soviet Union expanded its influence in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, supporting revolutionary movements and cultivating alliances. The Middle East was a particular focus, as the USSR provided support to Egypt and Syria during the Arab-Israeli conflicts. Brezhnev sought to establish the Soviet Union as a global superpower, equal to and at times surpassing the United States. Yet Brezhnev was not blind to the dangers of unchecked confrontation. During the 1970s, he participated in a period of détente with the United States, which led to significant arms control agreements, most notably the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT I. These agreements were hailed as steps toward reducing the risk of nuclear war and improving East-West relations. However, détente faltered toward the end of the decade, particularly after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, which reignited Cold War tensions and drew the Soviet Union into a protracted conflict that drained resources and international goodwill. By the late 1970s, Brezhnev's health was deteriorating rapidly. Years of ill health, compounded by heavy smoking, heart problems, and alleged dependence on sedatives, left him physically weakened. His public appearances became infrequent and halting, and he increasingly relied on close aides to manage affairs of state. Despite his frailty, he clung to power, and the political system, dominated by an aging gerontocracy, resisted renewal. The final years of his rule symbolized the sclerosis of the Soviet system itself. Economic stagnation deepened, corruption spread unchecked, and the leadership grew increasingly detached from the realities facing ordinary citizens. Foreign policy missteps, particularly the Afghan War, drained resources and tarnished the USSR's international image. By the time Brezhnev died in November 1982, the Soviet Union was still a superpower in military terms, but was hollowed out internally. Brezhnev's legacy is one of contradiction. For many in the Soviet Union, his era is remembered with nostalgia as a time of stability, relative prosperity, and predictability, compared with the hardships of the Stalin era or the chaos of the 1990s that followed the USSR's collapse. Brezhnev's time is seen by some as a golden age. At the same time, historians emphasize that his conservatism and failure to reform the system sowed the seeds of the USSR's eventual collapse. His tolerance of corruption, reliance on patronage, and inability to confront economic stagnation left the state brittle. Internationally, Brezhnev's tenure reinforced the USSR's status as a global superpower, but his policies also locked the Eastern Bloc into a rigid orthodoxy that stifled reform and widened the gap between the communist world and the West. His leadership style, emphasizing consensus and caution, ensured short-term stability but at the long-term cost of vitality. Ultimately, Brezhnev exemplified the paradox of the Soviet system itself: powerful, resilient, and impressive on the surface, yet fragile and decaying beneath. His rule extended the life of the Soviet state but did little to ensure its future. In this sense, Brezhnev's reign was both a high point of Soviet prestige and the beginning of the end of the Soviet experiment. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to Blistering History.